So next up is Iseult White, and I am really delighted to welcome Iseult here to join us. So Iseult has a wide and varied number, has held a wide and varied number of roles in her life. She is an author, computer scientist, and psychotherapist. She's an experienced independent director, and very recently, was appointed to the board of Hubble by Heather Humphreys, the Minister for Rural and Community Development. Iseult is highly experienced as a computer scientist, something I only learned myself. So those she has worked with speak highly of her technological prowess, both in terms of her technological skills, as well as her considerable abilities as a technological communicator. She's delivered briefings on AI, data science, machine learning, blockchain, and the Internet of Things across both American continents. And she has also developed projects to implement change management and digital transformation across financial centers in the US, including Wall Street. So as I said, a woman of many skills, she's also a psychotherapist. She lectures at MA level in psychotherapy and maintains a small private practice. Her particular areas of expertise are eating disorders, trauma, and grief. Iseult is also a writer. Recently, she has written for the Sunday Independent about the impact of COVID and automation on the gender pay gap. Needless to say, it has been and will be negative unless remedied. And more recently still, she has featured in the Irish Times, both challenging the gross misrepresentation of our first seminar here when we launched the Irish Women's Lobby. And prior to that, in her letter condemning the actions of Amnesty International, who called for the removal, along with other luminaries like the National Women's Council, called for the removal of political and media representation from Irish women and other groups who dare to quote unquote defend biology. So we are really thrilled all together to welcome Iseult to join us and to hear what she has to contribute to this really important discussion about freedom of speech. Over to you, Iseult. I just see your microphone there. Perfect. Thank you. Looking forward to it, Iseult.
Good evening, everybody. I'm going to hire Christine the next time I want another job. That was like pretty out there for me. You know, because when I was invited to come and speak tonight about freedom of speech and, you know, God, honestly, I felt like a fraud because I'm actually a pretty ordinary member of the public just going about my life. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have any expertise in freedom of speech. I'm not an activist. And so you know, when this whole thing started with the amnesty letter, you know, on Twitter, I had less than 1,000 followers and mostly I tweeted about my poodles. So what I really wanted to do, I decided tonight, because I'm not an expert and can't even pretend to be an expert on freedom of speech, is just tell you a bit about my personal story and how I came into this position and what I have seen since I got here. So back in November 2020, in November 20th, 2020, TENI, which is Transgender Network Ireland, published a letter. The letter was signed and promoted by Amnesty International and 27 other NGOs in Ireland. Amnesty International obviously is not funded by our government, but all those NGOs are funded by the government, including the National Women's Council of Ireland, which is 90% funded by the government to around 900,000 euros a year. And when I saw that letter, I had such a strong visceral reaction to it. And I want to explain a little bit of all of the things that came together from my life experience that created that really visceral reaction. And the letter was published on the Friday, and I read it multiple times over the following days. And there's three aspects, three strands of my life that come together in it. One is that as a woman, you know, I just am a feminist. This is just not arguable. I'm not any specific kind of feminist. I don't subscribe to any one feminist set of theories, but I'm a feminist and I'm a woman. So that is an absolutely core, integral part of my identity. Obviously, I'm also Irish. And for me, being Irish and through a culture that was handed down to me is about a plural country that accepts multiple different kinds of identities. It's not a sectarian country. It's not a country where one religion should rule the roost. It's not a country where one identity is what should be brought to the fore. And that is the way I was raised in the Ireland that, you know, the Ireland of my family. Obviously, there was a part of it that was around amnesty, amnesty supporting this letter, because my grandfather, Sean McBride, was a co-founder of Amnesty. But for me, it's really important to explain to you that he was a co-founder of Amnesty based on a heritage gifted to him by his mother. His mother, Maud Gon McBride, first started fighting for the rights of political prisoners in 1890 when John Davitt was in Portland jail facing inhuman conditions. And she started protesting and trying to secure humane conditions for him. She herself was later imprisoned in Holloway jail by the British government. And then after our Free State was created, after our War of Independence and Civil War here in Ireland, she was imprisoned by the Irish Free State government for peacefully protesting. When she was imprisoned in Holloway, my grandfather was 14 and he fought for her release. He wrote letters left, right and centre. And he later, during the years after the Free State was created from 1921 on, he fought for Republican prisoners, and she did too, and they fought for prisoners' rights. So it was that heritage, that understanding of creating humane conditions and ensuring that political prisoners are treated with respect and with rights, which contributed to his founding of Amnesty International. And in the founding of Amnesty International, it was an organization at that time that was dedicated to the rights of prisoners of conscience, that they should not be imprisoned, tortured, or executed because of their opinions or religion. And it didn't matter whether you disagreed with their views, the important thing was they shouldn't be punished. And as a child, you know, every Christmas we would get a list of political prisoners. And we would sit around our kitchen table and my mother would keep this huge bag of Christmas cards and we'd cut them up and we'd create Christmas cards for all the political prisoners. And we would write letters to them, you know, and send those letters off. But even as a child, I understood that the prisoners didn't necessarily receive the letter, but that the action was the government saw that people were paying attention and that people respected their right to a conscience. So, when I read the amnesty letter, as I refer to it, something broke in my heart, really, to see Amnesty promoting this letter. And I want to describe why. Because when I read this letter, I recognized it as an example of a type of propaganda that's used in authoritarian regimes. And I'm going to explain that to you. I see it as having four parts. There was a definition of threat, a lack of transparency, a claim to authority, and a demand for censorship and punishment. For the definition of threat, that's a consistent tool used in propaganda to create a sense that there's an immediate situational threat, because it's really well understood that that increases the acceptance of propaganda. And it creates a sense of cohesion around an in-group. So that letter made it clear that a particular community was under grave threat, and that the threat comes from a variety of bigots, individuals, new grassroots organizations, outsiders, and foreigners, some of them apparently from the UK. There was a lack of transparency. There was no information given for how this information was collected, who these people and organizations were, what evidence they had of the bigotry. And there was a claim to authority, a claim to have authority on our behalf, on the behalf of the citizens of Ireland, that they can identify this threat. And because there was no information, there was no way to challenge their assertions. And so we are left as the citizens of Ireland with the notion that that organization and the signatories, including Amnesty International, Global Human Rights Organization, and 27 government-funded NGOs, so people who are voices for our government, are the ones who are to guide us through the threat. And then they made a demand, and that demand was for censorship and punishment. Anybody who didn't get with the program in the letter, well, their crimes are so hateful that they should be silenced through censorship in the media and denial of political representation. And so this letter is a fundamental attack on human rights. It attacks freedom of expression, it attacks freedom of association, and it attacks basic political representation. And like I say, these kind of propaganda statements are used in authoritarian dictatorships. And it's well understood that they create cohesion for an in-group and increase negative attitudes to an out-group. So who's in the in-group? Well, Amnesty, the National Women's Council of Ireland, the Irish Network Against Racism, Migrants' Rights Centre, Movement of Asylum Seekers in Ireland, Gay Health Ireland, Sporting Pride, look, the list goes on. I mean, who wouldn't in their right mind want to be a part of this group? These are the people who are fighting for good in our society. I probably, agree with 80 to 90% of their principles, really. And I probably would have considered them prior to this as part of my tribe. Who's in the out group? Well, me, obviously, now. But the key thing the letter said that was in the out group was people who associate themselves with far-right ideologies. And again, there we have the lack of transparency. Because when we look into it, we actually find that it is individuals and organizations who defend biology, who present false narratives, inaccurate science, and promote hate to trade in bigotry, people whose views are not based in truth, and these views are spread by outsiders, by people not native to Ireland. But the key sentences in there, when you actually boil it down to understand who are the people that are in the out group, are anyone that continues to use inaccurate science to denigrate trans people is increasing discrimination. Sex and gender are both spectrums. And that's the line. Sex and gender are both spectrums. So in the out group, it's nothing to do with far-right ideologies. It's to do with the belief that sex is biological, it's material, it's binary. And that discriminates against trans people. It apparently increases suicide, increases violence, and causes isolation. That's another part in the letter. And so when the logic is followed through, the letter clearly develops an arc that says, saying biological sex is real, that there are two sexes, male and female, is hate. Not just hateful, it's hate. And in fact, such a view is so heinous that people who hold that view should be denied legitimate representation by politicians and the media, and there should be a call for an end in giving airtime to their despicable brand of harassment. So now we know who the outgroup is. Nothing to do with far-right ideologies. It's to do with believing that biological sex is relevant and material. So this creates a huge chilling effect in our society because most people want to belong on the side of righteousness. This set of people have defined themselves on the side of righteousness, and they've said who the enemy is. This was not easy for me to respond to when I did respond to it because, I'm a feminist, I'm Irish, and my background is also queer. When I was in my early 20s, I moved to San Francisco and I lived in the queer community, was very happy there. I played there, I partied, I laughed. There's some of the time we were laughing when we should have been crying because the early 90s was a time that AIDS hit San Francisco and I watched my friends die. I went to so many funerals over a period of about 2 or 3 years. And so naturally, part of our life then was Queer Nation and queer activism. We're here, we're queer, we deserve rights. And so I have this complex relationship with the whole panoply of things that are going on with this letter. But ultimately, it was this idea that it's not legitimate to talk about the conflict that exists. Now, because of my queer identity, or that aspect of my life that contributes to who I am in the world, I absolutely did support the Gender Recognition Act in 2015, because I've seen how difficult life was for trans people seeking to transition, particularly lesbians who had very little money or access to medication and often ended up self-medicating, and the impacts were not good. And so I absolutely fundamentally believe every adult has the right to to autonomy, to seek the right kind of medication and support to transition and live their life with dignity. And at that time, and I hold my hands up, I didn't understand the unseen consequences from self-ID. And I still support trans people's, ability to identify in their gender as they want to. But I didn't foresee the unseen consequences. But those consequences have become very clear over time. And we have this conflict we need to deal with in our society. We've been told by these NGOs and by Amnesty that we're not allowed to speak about this conflict. So what I kind of wanted to tell you was, as a very ordinary person, which is what I am, just a very ordinary person, I ended up speaking up about the letter. And yes, what I said got some traction, because obviously my grandfather founded Amnesty. But when I sent that tweet, the night I sent that tweet, I had no idea that was going to happen. But what I have learned since is that speaking up is not so difficult. It just takes speaking. It takes writing words. So I wrote, I saw that the Scottish hate crime legislation was going on. So I made a submission to the Scottish hate crime legislation, and that submission was one of the many submissions that went into the Justice Committee originally deciding to, as Lisa explained, to actually put in a special condition around transgender identity, which was later taken away. But what I really want to say to you is that we have our own hate crime legislation coming up. And our own hate crime legislation doesn't define women as a separate class. It includes us under gender, and gender includes gender, gender expression, and gender identity. There's no real characteristics that would capture hate of misogyny. The hate crime legislation has a fairly, non-legal definition, which says that hatred means detestation, significant ill will or hostility of a magnitude likely to lead to harm or unlawful discrimination against people, a person or a group of people due to their association with a protected characteristic. Well, the Amnesty letter tells us what these NGOs define as hatred. So as we go through the process of the hate crime legislation being enacted in Ireland, that's something that we all just need to be aware of, and we need to look at what happened in Scotland, and we need to understand what is going on around the world, and define for ourselves each, just as ordinary people, I think, how we want to respond to that. Because I'm frightened. When I read the Amnesty letter first, I really didn't think that people would think that there was hate involved in saying that sex is binary. I mean, I thought it was really cool. Like, everybody gets that gender is a spectrum, but I didn't really get that anybody would really think that sex is binary was hateful. But through following the hate crime legislation as it passed through Scotland, it is quite clear that what is set out in this letter is the agenda that we're living within. And it's a time for us all to reflect in Ireland as to what society we want to create. And it actually wouldn't matter to me with the amnesty letter what protected characteristic was supposedly being protected. It's the nature of the letter. It's the nature of the propaganda. It's the nature of the authoritarian approach to removing freedom of expression, freedom of association, and political representation from people that I object to. That is fundamentally the thing I object to. And so I'm doing just exactly as what my great grandmother used to do. She said, you know, despite that she was involved with violence in some earlier days, she ended up deciding that the pen was mightier than the sword. So I just keep writing letters. I'm writing letters to politicians. I'm writing letters to the newspaper. I'm writing articles, and I tweet. And I'm not naturally somebody that likes being on Twitter, but I know from my Twitter analytics that a lot of people are reading the things I share. So I keep writing about stuff. And I don't know what else to do, but if anybody out there is from Ireland and wants to create action out in the world to try and protect our democratic rights here, I'm with you and I'll join in with you. And so that's really the message I wanted to give, that I'm just a very ordinary person who ended up caught up in this, but I'm going to keep speaking, because for me, even with all of those different strands in my life, I believe fundamentally that we must protect our democratic right to discuss the issues, to have dialogue, and to resolve the conflicts. So that's really all I have to say. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Iseult. That was just really wonderful and very moving, as I have to say. I would have to say as well, I know I was very moved by the personal connection that you made to what happened in the amnesty letter and to your own family history as well. I know it would resonate with a lot of people here in Ireland. And of course, the points that you made around the hate crime bill, it is so worrying. And I know we'll be having further discussion about that later, but it's like, it's my reading of it to one extent also is that because Ireland never transposed the equality legislation correctly, and we never had sex as a protected characteristic, that now they're actually removing even the faint aura of protection that women had through gender, because now that because it seems to me that the hate crime bill is going to double down by specifically expanding gender to include gender identity and gender expression. It actually removes any issue of sex being, and not including sex, of course, under the heading of gender. It actually effectively denies women rights under the head. I would read it as, and of course I'm not a lawyer, but I would worry that it would basically render women as having no protections whatsoever under equality legislation. It would actually double down on the harms. So let's hope I'm wrong, and let's hope we can do something and learn from the experience of other people in Scotland and in Norway as well, and other places where they have hate crime speech. And I know we'll be hearing from Megan as well next, because I'm going to start moving to introducing her now. But listen, thanks, Iseult. We'll be talking later. We'll be discussing some questions in from our participants, our audience, and we'll be discussing these issues more. But listen, thanks again, Iseult. That was incredible, really fantastic contribution this evening. Thank you.